Thank you for coming back. Always. The handout that I gave you is not a shameless advertisement for St. Mary's Episcopal Church. It was because I couldn't find the disc that I saved this document on in 1993. So I have one copy, and we reprinted it here. But like the last handout you got, it was from a series of articles that I was doing for the diocesan-wide newspaper, the Virginia Episcopalian. And I was asked to do this because of my work in the field of process thought. So probably it could be saved for you to ask questions about next time, but it's got a lot of material in it, and one of the things that I need to always say when we talk about this, we're talking about some very technical stuff in this field, and I've tried to write it and rewrite it in ways that are less technical. Even so, it gets to be a little bit tedious, and so just hang in there. I'm going to try to give some analogies that can help you relate to it, because it's all relational. The Brits like to call this process theology. It always sounds so much better than process, but I'm probably going to stick with the American version. There have been a number of people that have come aboard the school of process thought since the 1960s. And that's where we kind of begin this one. Last time I was talking about the fact that traditional theism, with its perfect God, perfect in power, perfect in love, or omnibeneficence, is confronted with a stubborn fact, and that is, how can this God coexist with the reality of evil? On the about the fourth page, no, make that third page. In this handout, I do talk about the idea of theodicy. That's actually the second page, sorry. Theodicy is theos, God, and dikaios, basically to justify. So it's a justification of the ways of God vis-a-vis human pain and suffering. And there's always, there've been, since the beginning of the Christian era, and before that in the Hebrew era, before Christianity came on the scene, people were busily trying to figure this out. So if you look at the paragraph, the fourth whole paragraph on that page, it says, knowing full well that the dilemma disappears if and when evil is called ingenuine, the traditional theologians have usually taken this tack. Most have discounted the reality of evil by insisting that our problem is one of perspective. Even though we suffer pain, anguish, and loss in the course of our life, the final truth about these experiences is that they are only apparently evil. Now, we encounter evil in many different forms. We encounter it in terms of human malevolence, human apathy, natural disasters, disease, all sorts of causes of agony, pain, and suffering. And so most people today are not going to buy the fact that this is only apparently evil. Now, the congregation is reading Rachel Held Evans' book. She's a classical example of what we're talking about. She was doing such good for the world, and a wonderful young spokesperson for the Christian faith, having really examined Scripture and really thought through many, many theological issues. she was producing books and doing tapes and making appearances, and all of a sudden a combination of factors brought on by the flu took her life. She snuffed out. Now, she left behind a wonderful legacy, but what could have been? You think about that. And I have to say that she is an example of evil besetting the world. How did this happen? Especially if you've got a God who's in control, the omnicompetent God of love. How is that possible? And you can go through your whole panoply of examples of this that you know. And someone's got to come up with a new way of discussing this. And so it goes on, appealing to the mystery of God's will or the magnificence of God's overarching purpose, or the probability that suffering is actually an experience of divine testing or punishment or warning. The traditional theodicies seek to undermine the perception that evil is real. Sometimes the argument is that suffering is actually good because it builds human character. Another variant of the basic defense of God is that evil is necessary because it enables us to appreciate good by contrast. We've gone over these. I just call that to your attention. It's a paragraph where I try to summarize what has been done, all of the gymnastics that theologians and philosophers have gone through to try to justify the pair of perfections of traditional theism with the reality of suffering. I also called to your attention last time that the neo-Orthodox movement was one that happened in the early 20th century with Karl Barth and Emil Brunner and Paul Tillich and the Niebuhr brothers and so forth. And their attempt was to basically push aside the old models of traditional theism and simply dive back into biblical literature and to go, as Luther says, sola scriptura, by scripture alone. The problem is that humanity, as knowledge has built over time and evolved to a place where people are thinking very seriously for themselves, and not simply just sitting back and being told what's going on by somebody, some expert from the pulpit or some expert from a university. Yes?
John, is there a distinction made by anybody between evil that is what we would call unfortunate, or like you were talking about the lady that just got sick and died, as opposed to the evil that a man or a person would do to another person?
Many people distinguish between moral evil, which is associated with human malevolence, from non-moral evil, which has to do with basically things that are not caused by humans, like bubonic plague.
Hitler opposed to
the bubonic plague.
Yeah.
Both have terrible results. So yeah, there are a lot of people that do that, and if you want to get into the field of moral evil, then the Niebuhr brothers are my guides, both Reinhold and Richard Niebuhr. They're the ones who want to talk about this, and they didn't develop a systematic theology that had a doctrine of God in it. But I am told, through my guide, Donald Daw, that when once asked, Reinhold Niebuhr once asked what his concept of God was, he said, well, I think a Whiteheadian God. And we'll get to what Whitehead has to do with it. That's process theology, or process theology. So yes, there are people that want to talk about disasters, calamities, plagues, the whole issue of many of us in this room have been touched by cancer, either directly or indirectly with a loved one. What is this we're dealing with? It's a very, very difficult problem, because one of the things about cancer, and I'm not a physician, but I know this much, having gone through it with my late wife, is that it's your own cells. it's not someone injecting something into you, or someone or having some kind of a disease that is spread by contagion. It is basically something that's happened within you to your own cells. It may have a cause, it may not have an apparent cause. Dealing with cancer, you're dealing with something that seems to be an abnormality to what we think the normal human body, how it operates. Why does it do this? We don't know, and and physicians and clinicians and research scientists are working on this all tirelessly to figure out the mechanism that causes a gene to light up and go crazy and make up its own rules every day. But I was referring to the Neo-Orthodox. They were trying to get away from the traditional perfections of God, theistic arguments, and to put Aristotle aside as the philosopher that describes the big picture of the world, into which the filler is the witness of the scriptures about God and humankind, and in particular for Christians, what Jesus has to do with all of this. And they were searching for ways to say things to modern human beings without getting into philosophy too much. But like Luther, they did resort to philosophy here and there, but they didn't have a big picture person. And that is, when we talk about metaphysics, and these are it's not hyphenated, but I'm just dividing them. You're talking about a beyond the physical. There is a big overarching picture of the big picture of what is happening in the world. How do you explain events in the world philosophically? And by the 1960s, there were people calling for a metaphysic in the world of theology. Even though the old one may not be working, we need one. So let's find one. And at the same time, you think about what was happening in the world of physics. People like Einstein, people in relativity theory all over the world, quantum mechanics, they were getting past the old Newtonian mechanical view of the universe, and they were looking at a much more dynamic picture of the universe and how the universe operates. So the people in physics were already doing this. And onto the scene comes a man named Alfred North Whitehead. He was a British mathematician in the early part of the 20th century. He taught mathematics at Cambridge, Trinity College, Cambridge for many years. Then he went to the University of London and taught there. And then he was asked to come over to the United States and teach at Harvard with a chair of physics. And that's where he began doing his groundbreaking work in metaphysics. So A.N. Whitehead, I had a colleague years ago, an Episcopal colleague, named Whitehead, and he named his dog Alfred North. A.N. Whitehead was doing very, very new things in the field of philosophy. He was trying to come up with a way in which he could get to the basic ideas about without which nothing happens in the universe. Now that's a big statement, but there are kind of rules for how things happen. And there are patterns that he was discerning, and he produced a number of lectures, but the big one is his book, Process and Reality. (1929). It immediately set off controversy among the philosophers who were reading this, not only because he was proposing a whole new way of looking at the world, but because this guy who actually grew up as the son of an English parson, kind of had, in his youth, as a mathematician and a scientist, had rejected God. All of a sudden, in this philosophy of organism, is how he described it, a philosophy of organism. He introduces the concept of God, and that caused people in the philosophical world to scratch their heads, and some of them to laugh, and some of them to simply reject what Whitehead was saying altogether. But not everybody did, and he was named to a number of prizes in Britain and in the United States for this work. When he was at Harvard, he had a teaching assistant, a young man who'd done his Ph.D. at Harvard, named Charles Hartshorne. It looks like Hartshorne, but he pronounced it Hartshorne. He taught at the University of Chicago after working with Whitehead. He taught at, he ended his career, he was at Emory for a while, and he ended his long career at the University of Texas, Austin. And he wrote and wrote till the very end of his life. He died in the year 2000 at a very old age. So those two were the leading proponents of this new way of thinking about things. Now, how does that look? And what does the concept of God look like in process thought? First of all, they said that the universe is more dynamic than static, that like an organism or a society or a community, it's more alive than dead, that it is constantly evolving into new and better things. It is adapting and improvising and evolving. And the basic category that they introduced, the basic category of reality, is becoming. In other words, the universe is composed of more of events where things are becoming than brute matter or bits of concrete bits of the world. In other words, if you think of yourself, do you think of yourself as a thing? No. What do you think of yourself? How does your body function? Well, not as well as it used to, probably. But the body's functioning is miraculous. It's wonderful. It's mysterious. I remember talking to a surgeon that I was in my congregation, and he said one of the things about healing is we know it happens, but we don't know why it happens. That's a wonderful thought. You know, it's a great mystery. We know if we do certain things and avoid certain other things, that things happen, but we don't know exactly why. So the idea is that at the basis of all reality, there are creative events of becoming. In other words, freedom is not a gift to the world. Freedom just is. So the basic underlying fact of reality is process or becoming. And what Whitehead said was, from the lowest to the highest beings in reality, they're all characterized by this freedom or will to be something, to become something. And that they all have some form of subjective freedom. Now that sounds a little crazy. If you think about rocks and things like that. Does a rock have subjective reality? Does it have freedom to choose what it's going to be? Well, it has a whole lot less, said Whitehead, than a human being. Meaning that the lower order in the universe pretty much replicates what it should become and stay with it. But sometimes things go awry. I mentioned the idea of cells thinking on their own and breaking away from the body's normal parameters and start developing a tumor. That is not the ideal way for a body to act. The thing is that if you think that everything from the lowest puff of existence, said Whitehead, to the reality of God is characterized by the same idea, the will to become something, then you've got freedom throughout the whole system. God is, for Whitehead, is not the exception to reality that is standing outside of reality. God is the chief exemplification of the process. One of the things that Whitehead, if you were writing biblically in Whitehead's world, you'd say, in the beginning, process. And the process conceived God. Now that is a radical statement. Now what that means is that the first instance of process or creative synthesis is the being of God. God is the reality with which all other entities, events in the process must reckon. The thing about God is God has both, this is an unfortunate term that they use because of psychiatry, but reality is bipolar. That means that reality has a mental pole and a physical pole. And if you're looking at God, God has the same kind of characteristics of this, but what Whitehead would call the mental pole is the primordial nature of God. This is the part of God that transcends the world, that never changes. This is the part of the world, this is the part of God that is over and above all the other entities in the universe. And this part of God can conceive the best pattern of harmony, peace, beauty, benevolence, justice that there can be. That doesn't sound very radical, because we always think about God that way. The thing that's very difficult, different, is that God also has a physical pole, and this is called the consequent nature of God. The consequent nature of God actually is involved in the process of reality. The consequent nature of God feels, that's a huge word in philosophy, feels what's going on, or apprehends what's going on in all of reality at once, as it happens. Does that make sense? The idea of God being physically a part of the process is that God actually is affected by the process. That's huge. Now, if this part of God can conceive the best of all possible worlds for the process, this part of God feels exactly how it's going. So if, say, in Hartshorne was one that wanted to use an analogy of the mind and the body to describe this. If you think of yourself picking up a portrait of yourself, a photograph of you when you were 2 years old, and you look at that picture and ask, where is this person? You done that? That's a good exercise. Where is this person? Well, the person is here, but the person has changed over time. The person has adapted, the person has been wounded, the person is healed, the person has been sick, the person got well, the person got educated, the person might have started a family, and so forth. You go on and on and on. And then have other physical challenges and mental challenges and all sorts of challenges that have resulted in who you are today. It's not just your genetics, although some of my geneticist friends would say it is just your genetics. It's not just your genetics, it's your environment as well. So if you got all sorts of things acting on you, well, what constitutes the you that hasn't changed. Again, my teacher, Donald, used to describe this as ego strength. There is something of the mind that doesn't change. The brain changes, but the mind, which transcends the brain, it stands outside of who we are. The mind actually has an impact on the rest of the body. And that mind is the ego strength that has kept you, if it's working well, over time, there is you could see a sequence of yous going over time. Yes?
How does prayer change the primordial and consequent?
It actually does a lot. Because if God is the only reality, the only entity in the universe that can feel the entire impact of the process, that means God hears your prayer. That God is affected by what you are saying. I'll give you an example of this. People have asked me, and those of you who have had this experience of praying for one that you love, you have some assumptions about God. As Ross McKenzie, another teacher of mine, used to say, your idea of God and your idea of prayer are directly correlated. If you don't think God is listening, or is apart, impassive, unaffected, then what's the point? But if you do think God is listening, that actually is affected by what you're saying, then God is actually picking up the distress signals that are coming from part of the creation, and will do something in the primordial pole. The consequent pole will feel, the primordial pole will think new strategies for the person that's being affected. And so praying for someone with a terrible disease, one of the things I conceive of is ordering chaos, God ordering chaos. There is, and remember in the first meeting of this study, we talked about the fact that traditional theists like to say that God is created out of nothing, ex nihilo. Remember that? That means that God precedes the universe. God is the exception to the universe. And this is not saying that at all. This is saying that God is actually, if you look at Genesis and the account of, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. There are many biblical theologians that see that without form and void as a primordial chaos that God was working with. Later, you get the second creation story. You've got God creating the human out of, do you remember what the human was made out of? Mud. Adam is made out of Adamah, the mud, because there was mist over the earth, and so when God picked up the clay, it was moist, it was mud, and God fashioned the man, Adam, meaning the human, not Adam as a name. And what did God do then? Breathed into the nostrils of the form that he had made, and the person became a living being, a nephesh. And it goes on from there. The idea of God the fashioner of the clay, or God the orderer of chaos, is what I see in prayer. It doesn't ask for an exception to the rules. That is, for instance, there are people who believe that miracles are suspensions of reality. I think that miracles, and most of us has seen some form of miracle in our lifetime. When you see something working that shouldn't be working, there is something that is happening in the process. And I would say that appealing to God in prayer, in the process of reality, we ask God to, it's not as if God's not aware, obviously, but we're throwing our weight in to the same wavelength or bandwidth of God focused on this person. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Steve, or not.
Pretty long.
That's the way it goes. You ought to try writing a dissertation. Yes?
His eyes on the sparrow, which one of those two, or do both of those apply?
They both apply, but this is the eyes. But what happens with the sensation, if you think about the human being, the mind and body, the human being's mind is pretty much telling the body's cells and systems how to operate. Now, if the cells and the systems are out of whack, the mind's got to improvise to get it back in line. That's called healing. At least that's the way I see it. Yes?
So, you're saying, when you talk about prayer and God, we're really asking God to intervene. And
Yes and no.
Inexplicable miracle, right? So outside of reality, which means supernatural in my mind. So we're asking God to intervene, and sometimes He does, i.e. miracles, and sometimes He doesn't. And how do we look at that?
What you're, and I hear you loud and clear. That's what we're all brought up on, from the pulpit. That was the way it was. God hears prayers. God answers prayers in different ways. And what these are theodicies. They're basically saying, even though you didn't get your prayer answered, and I can tell you that I was told that about my dad growing up. I just needed to pray harder so that God could hear. Now, there are biblical stories that have lent a lot of credence to that. Remember the guy standing outside of the house knocking and knocking and knocking and knocking, and finally the guy comes to the door. Well, that is a parable of Jesus talking about persistence. I think that is a good thing. Persistence is a good thing. But I would say that process thought has said that it is not supernatural. The natural world is process, and God is in it.
Who can affect the process?
God is not only can affect the process, but God is in it. Remember that we were looking at that story about G.A. Studdard Kennedy about the people in the trenches of World War I. Well, literally, God is in the trenches. And when G.A. Studdard Kennedy came up with the idea that God is the crucified God, and when he pointed to the young man said, "What's God like, Padre?" And he points to the crucifix, and he said, "God is like that." He made an intuitive leap that was really correct. God is like that. But traditional theism doesn't have a way you can go from one to the other, because God is not supposed to suffer in traditional theism. But we know biblically that God does suffer. In fact, all you have to do is go to the story of the Passion narratives. I remember one of my New Testament teachers said that the four Gospels are basically Passion Week with a prologue attached to it. That's what it's all about, the passion of Jesus, the entry into Jerusalem to the death and resurrection. This is the main story. And so 4 different perspectives are looking at that main story and then attaching a point of view to it. A process thinker would not say it's a suspension of reality. A process thinker would say it is something happening within the process. And that's the different thing. It conceives the universe in terms of a kind of dynamic, social interconnection, a web of interconnecting events. When I talked about me over time being a set of, here we go over time. If you took some pictures over time, this is the way it would appear. Is the events. I'm a series of events that are happening. My systems, my brain, how I look physically and so forth is a system of events. And they, over time, have been acted upon by God. That's the way I see it as a Christian. That God is actually directing the process of me. And I ask, the idea of having spiritual study or spiritual direction or going to church and praying and having group prayer, corporate prayer, and so forth. This is all about basically focusing in on what God is always focused in on. Remember the old radios? And you'd have to, I built a shortwave radio when I was a kid with my dad sitting in a wheelchair beside me. When you tune in on a channel on the old analogs, do you remember what it sounded like? That's right. It would be you could tell when you finally got it tuned. And that was kind of what I'm saying is, prayer for me is kind of like that. God is always involved with all of us at all times and knows what's going on with us at all times as it happens. And God is now not only the great feeler, as Whitehead says, the fellow sufferer who understands. If you take and unpack that phrase, the fellow sufferer who understands. The fellow sufferer means that God is actually in touch with everything, including suffering, pain, and death.
So if we didn't pray at all, what would be the situation?
God would be still working to do.
He'd still be doing whatever he's doing. And so our prayers have that much effect on God that he might change his opinion about how things are going?
Actually, there are biblical precedents for God changing his mind. I use the word, and I apologize for using the male pronoun.
I agree.
I grew up in all of that. It's hard for me I want to have something personal there, and I don't think God's self doesn't do it for me. So, but there is a change in God. For instance, remember in the people of Nineveh, for instance, or the flood itself. When Jonah is, part of that whole narrative where the people of Nineveh could be destroyed, God saw the people of Nineveh repent, and God changed his mind, says the scripture. Wow, that's big. Traditional theism has no provision for God changing God's mind.
There's lots of times in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, where God is angry because we don't follow what he wants us to do. Forget about prayer. He just, he says to Joshua, this is what you have to do. You have to go around the wall this certain amount of times.
Yeah.
Oh, Moses, you have, whatever. And so there seems to be, he has a plan to get your prayers, and then at other times he sort of says, I'll accept what you have to say. And maybe you have a better idea.
Well, I do think that there is strength in corporate prayer. I do think that. It doesn't go unnoticed. In other words, God is always in touch and knows what's happening. But when God perceives a concerted effort to change in a people, say, I would say that one of the things about God is that God is the consummate improviser. That God will improvise and come up with a new plan. In terms of sports, if you think of God as the quarterback, he calls a lot of audibles at the line because he sees what's happening on the field. The field is changing, God calls an audible.
Yeah, but
Changes all
a lot of preachers talk about that God knows everything that's going to take place already. So,
No.
all right.
Well, they do. They do that.
Right.
But that's not what a process thing
All
is.
right.
I've noticed, I've said it probably 4 times
Right.
now. God knows everything that happens as it happens. I didn't say before it happens. Now, God could probably sense the contour or the arc of where things are going. Like, for instance, God could have probably realized that when Adolf Hitler started off in his foray against the Jews in Europe, you could probably tell that it was going to end in disaster. But the process thinker would usually say that God adapts, changes, improvises, calls audibles, whatever you want to call it, to deal with reality. I had a question over here. Yes.
Well, so it appears that God is not a Democrat. Because I read a book about this young child who was beautifully healed. And mom and dad cried out, and they called the cousins, and they called the aunts and uncles. And at the same time, while the child was in surgery, 12 people were fervently praying. But there are other situations where there's thousands of people who pray for something, and it doesn't come about. So voting, quantity of votes, doesn't seem to be what makes this work. So talk to me about the quality.
It might be the rightness of the cause, or it could be a lot of things, but this doesn't explain everything. What it's trying to do is to lay out a big picture as to how things happen in this world. That is what the philosopher's trying to do. These two philosophers are coming up with analogies to describe the basic ideas by which the world operates. Aristotle had done it before, and it ended up with a God that was so remote that it didn't work. So now these guys are coming up with a big picture of the world, a metaphysic that says that God is involved in the world. If you say, think about the word Emmanuel, which we're about to get, O come, Emmanuel. It means God is with us. In fact, I have this is a digression, but I found a belt buckle among my grandfather's things from his father in Germany that had the Kaiser's crown on it and Gott mit uns printed, God with us. So a lot of people have said God is with us, but the Hebrew idea, God with us, is something that we believe. We believe it. And what the process thinkers are trying to do is to describe how. If the scriptures are telling us why, the metaphysicians are telling us how. That helps me. It helps me think about how is it that God is a suffering God? The intuitive leap that Studdard Kennedy made was that God, the crucifixion of Jesus, was the manifestation of the suffering God. I told you about Rabbi Kushner and When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He's got a wonderful, I may bring it next time, a wonderful piece on the suffering God in his book. And he said, I don't know what it would be like to have a God who suffers, that cries real tears, that feels real pain, that bleeds real blood. We do know that. And if we take Jesus seriously as a manifestation of God, that is this is God the Son, then in him we see the summary of what God is like. That's why Studdard Kennedy was on to the right track. He just didn't go far enough. The process people came in on the heels of Studdard Kennedy and says, this is how it could be that God is in the trenches or God is on the cross. So, is that good? Someone else asked a question.
Well, if God hears our prayers and God may act on our prayers, but doesn't, that somehow leads me to the conclusion that there's something wrong with my prayers, or I'm not praying the right way, or to me that is opening that door that, now I'm doing the very best I can here, Lord, this is the only way I know how to pray.
Right.
That just doesn't seem right to me. I just need help with that.
We all need help with that. And I think that's the basic point. In a situation dominated by the old traditionalists who used Aristotle to describe the big picture, when you pray to that God is above and beyond the world, transcendent. And the Hebrews knew that wasn't right. Jesus knew, for heaven's sake, knew that wasn't right. And so we've been trying to figure out how the beautiful biblical phrases and stories and parables, how they can be in this world created by God. And so if you're thinking about it, I have a quote from one of the process theologians named Schubert Ogden. He was a student of Charles Hartshorne, and his article is "Evil and Belief in God, the Distinctive Relevance of a Process Theology." And what he says is this: to be anything actual at all, whether the least such thing that can be conceived or the greatest, is to be an instance of process or creative synthesis. And therefore the outcome, this is the key, the outcome of a free response to the free decisions of others, already actual. In other words, when something comes to be in this world, and Whitehead called them actual entities, others call them, Hartshorne called them creative synthesis, but an instance of process is like a creative event, a synthesizing event. In other words, when something comes to be in this universe of they conceive, it's actually taking into account things that have happened before it. You can think of that about your DNA. There are lots of things that have happened before you, and they're in you. And that is one big deal that you need to deal with. They made a chart one time, or at least I did. All right, suppose something, this is an actual entity, X, coming to be. It's forming. Something is being formed. Now try to think in terms that are not concrete. This event is about to take place, whether it's in the cellular level or in God's self. So what happens is that there are already A, B, C, D, and so forth to infinity, things that have already happened before X. So X has to reckon with the fact that things have happened before it. Now, what's there to prevent a chaos from happening if X chooses one and the next one chooses this one? And it could be a total chaos, but the world isn't a total chaos, is it? We see instances of chaos. In fact, again, Kushner would say that the creation will have a big sign on it that says God at work, not men at work, God at work. In other words, it's in progress. It's a thing in process. So if you've got a universe where things are self-determinative to some degree, and it's all from the height of being of God to the least puff of existence, there's some subjective freedom here to order itself. What regulates the system? What regulates the process? God regulates the process. And what God does is to suggest, let's call this Plan G. God suggests an aim to X and says, this is your best course. It's like a blueprint. If you were going to build a house, you'd probably go get a blueprint. You wouldn't just start nailing stuff up, I hope. But so the planner, the one who can conceive of the best possible universe, offers you or offers the entity forming the best possible choice to organize itself by.
Maybe God had a plan when he made the earth. He said, Adam and Eve, here's the perfect place. You're going to be here. Everything's going to be perfect. And they screwed it up.
Yeah.
They screwed it up.
All right, think about
and
that.
So then God...
You just told the story
right,
of the universe.
Right. And God's now at his wit's end. He's like, what am I going to do now? Now I've opened this can of worms, sort of, and everything is going crazy. And now he's got to...
And got so fed up with it, he decided to take an eraser and erase the entire board, and then went, maybe I ought to save a few of them and put them in a boat. That's right. The whole thing is that we hear that the living being is made in a particular way. You remember how Genesis said it? In the image of God, or likeness of God. That doesn't mean looks like God. It means that it has attributes that are God-like. In other words, creative freedom. The human has creative freedom, and the human misused it. And that is set off a chain. God is affected by it. God is disappointed. God is angered. You go through Scripture, and this is a great story. You know, God displays, it could be called anthropomorphism to talk like this, but God displays human-like emotions throughout Scripture. And you get to Jesus, where you have an actual human standing there, being God's person in the flesh, and you see him have a range of emotions, do you not?
Yeah.
He wept at Lazarus' tomb. He got angry in the temple. He was disappointed, and he called out people all the time because he was frustrated. So that is the story, and this is the philosopher coming in and saying, look, this is remarkably relevant to the story. What we're saying is remarkably relevant because it puts God in the trenches with you. God is affected and feels all this. Yes?
How would a process theologian explicate the country song, Thank God for Unanswered Prayers?
Thank God for
Unanswered prayers.
unanswered prayers. I really am not sure I could speak for all process theologians, but the fact is that when I said that they have to reckon with other things, let me just finish this little description. What if X says, nah, God, I don't think so. I think I'm going to take C instead. Now, and it becomes this way. Now, that's an actual event that's happened, and all future events now have to take that into account. So if there is a landslide effect, if you think about the process of reality, it's all alive, it's all interconnected, it's social. And so basically, the actual entities or the creative events are taking into account everything that happened before it. Now, when you talk about unanswered prayer, you could be looking at a tsunami. Think about what it took to correct what was happening with the Axis power. Think about what it took. How many millions died to correct what the Axis powers did in their choice to become world dominant? And it ended in a horrific event in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, firebombing of Dresden, you go through the whole thing, and we come up and we say, well, that took a while for God to affect a change. So if you have a tsunami of bad choices, God is working with that to change it. But for instance, in a cancer patient, if the cancer patient does not survive, it doesn't mean that God was not involved in it. In fact, I would say that God is supremely involved in it, and the model is the crucified God. So what God is working to do is to come up with a new good, a transformed reality that can help the system go forward. That's a response. Yes.
Brendan Manning tells the story of friends he had who had a new baby, and the 3-year-old sister insisted that she needed to talk to the baby alone. And the parents were a little skittish about that, but finally they consented, but they left the nursery door open. The 3-year-old held on to the bars of the crib and said, "Baby, baby, tell me what God is like. I'm beginning to forget." And I'm saying that, you know, from way back, what is God like? But, and I think process theology philosophers are trying very hard to figure it out. But I think of the mystery of it. And, you know, the country music singer, let the mystery be. And that's, we see through a darkly, but someday we'll know as we have been known.
Right. But the idea of mystery is appealing to a huge legacy of Christians over time. It is a very appealing idea. The one thing that I keep focusing on is this notion of God with us, God here and now, God affected by what we're affected by, and really caring. God is actually involved in our suffering and is working to transform it into a new good for us. Now, it doesn't always come out the way we want it, and I think you can account for it by the fact that there's so many, I don't know what the factor would be, of all these actual entities coming together. God is the orderer of the process. God does a super good job. If, we didn't worry about getting out of the bed and whether there would be gravity this morning for us to stand. That is that's an example of God doing a good job of ordering the chaos that could be. Or you could look at just the human body and how the human body functions. It's a beautiful miracle that I would say that is ordered by God. And when it gets out of order, then we need to call in the reinforcements and to help get it back. So I hear you and I sympathize, and I've certainly been there, but I just personally keep coming back to the God in the trenches, the God on the cross.
Well, I
know
would
you
agree
would.
with you.
I know you would. The thing about remembering what God is like, that's a really beautiful story. Plato could have told that story. The idea of, this is way oversimplification, but teachers often use a Socratic method. You're aware of that. And the Socratic method is a series of questions to the student. And the idea behind the Socratic method is that the philosopher or the teacher acts as a gadfly to basically come at the student, to get the student to remember what he or she already knows. Education means drawing out of you something that's already in you. At least that's one way of looking at it. And the idea is that Plato believed that the soul glimpsed perfection before incarnation. And that is, the soul, how do you know something is beautiful? How can we take two people and look at a building and say, that's beautiful? How do we know that? That's what they were doing at. They were going at innate knowledge. So the baby was closer than the 3-year-old to the perfections. And the baby was being asked to, help me, I'm beginning to forget. And the idea that Plato used was you're remembering what you already know. Somebody else had a question, I think. Yeah.
One more question. I think some of this stuff works intellectually when we are sitting here in a sanitary environment, but it's hard to remember when it affects you personally, and it gets emotional when it's your daughter, your sister.
Yeah.
And
I can tell you, it's exactly that.
And I'm confused. Yes, you can. But one of the backwards ways I look at this is doggone it. It's hard to fault God for Hitler, but when those guys were going to kill him, the assassination team had it all figured out, except Hitler moved to a different room and the bomb wasn't effective. So why didn't God help them?
Well, the process thinker would say God was helping them, but Hitler had a choice to make, and that's the subjective freedom for malevolence as well as self-preservation or whatever. I do think that when I'm called upon, now retired, but going into a situation where there's something horrific that has happened, and parents turn to me and ask, where is God? That's the same question that Kushner raised, that Elie Wiesel raised in Night, where is God? And the answer that he came up with, the Christians take a different way, is God is there on the gallows, the little boy that's suffering as he's being hanged. A Christian knows what that is. A Christian knows that there is where God is. God is not with the Nazis. God is with the struggling boy. So I just, I'll let it rest on that. Is that it? Is there
More.
one more? One more.
I just want to thank you for introducing the topic, which is so abstract and difficult to
Very abstract.
integrate into what we've learned in the past. And I encourage everyone to read this book because I was this inspired, which is going to be discussed this week. And I just want to read this one section because it addresses many of the questions. It says, she says, many of its, the Bible of my youth was set up to fail. Many of its institutions taught me to expect something from the Bible that the Bible was never intended to deliver, namely an internally consistent and self-evident worldview that provides clear universal answers to all of life's questions. And then she goes on to say, as my exposure to science, travel, literature, and people of other faiths and backgrounds increased, many of the biblical positions I'd once held became emotionally and intellectually untenable. And then she further on says, God gave us a cacophony of voices and perspectives, all in conversation with one another, representing the breadth and depth of the human experience and all its complications and contradictions. And basically, that's what she concludes with. The Bible canonizes contradiction.
How about that?
It's
That's
amazing.
very nice, thank you. I
What
recommend
page is
reading
that,
book,
Cheryl?
too. Thank you very much, and we'll,
Next week.
one more week, right? One more week.
Thanks for sharing that.